depressed. If anything better comes along, your revenue looks a lot better, and you've got reasons at those quarterly updates to give rosy news to the people of Nova Scotia. And I know the finance minister enjoys that each time that he can come back and say that he's under budget again. Under budget, still neglecting to sort of point out that it's still millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in deficit. Nevertheless, running a tight ship if you listen to the finance minister. I mentioned the other day as well that the finance department spending is up 30% and just since 2009. You know, for a finance minister who's talking about restraint and control, it does really raise some questions. I think it might make some people even more cynical than they are now. And I hope when we get to estimates, we can really review what's been going on at the Department of Finance. But on the surface, we see about 85 more people working there than previously, and the budget up significantly, 30%, as I say, in that one department alone. So I think that is very important to look at. Now, one of the estimates that I think is important for everybody to look at is the estimate on what will the price of gasoline average out at in the coming year. And we all know that right now it's over $1.45 here in Halifax. It went up again on Thursday, and that's really, you know, almost a historic high, I would say. I can't remember it being that high in the past, and we expect it to rise more into the summer months when the demand is highest. So, Madam Speaker, what would you expect that the average might be for the coming year? And again, take into account that last year's average was $1.30. Today, the price is $1.45 in Metro. And we estimate in this budget, if you can believe it, that gasoline prices in the coming year will be $1.23 on average. And that, to me, just seems completely you know, ridiculous. It just does. But if you use the price of gasoline as a way to calculate your motor fuel tax or your HST that you're going to take in, then that will help to depress your revenue. It's one of the measures that we look at in the revenue side of this budget. And again, I just think it doesn't have any bearing in reality, Madam Speaker. And I think what's clear to say, I've talked about the difficulty that Nova Scotians are having with their own bills and with keeping, just affording life in Nova Scotia. And what's important is that when they pay high taxes, they certainly expect to have quality programs in place. And that's why I'm so concerned about the cuts to education and the cuts that we'll be seeing in health care as well. Really, we've been given less for what we're paying than we had previously, and under the NDP government, it has in fact been much less. And I think there's no two ways about that. Madam Speaker, I wanted to talk a little bit about the budget there for economic and rural development and tourism. And there's been, again, you know, a number of departments that have seen changes in their spending, and this is one that's grown quite tremendously. And I think it may relate right back to that Jobs Here Fund, or the new version of the Industrial Expansion Fund, which is, you know, and has been called by members of the current government, has been called a slush fund. It's something that makes funds available to businesses and to new enterprises, or to shore up businesses that might be in trouble, and it comes after those businesses have failed to meet the standard of Nova Scotia Business Inc. Nova Scotia Business Inc., NSBI, was set up by the previous government to give an arm's length, honest opinion about where investments were warranted and where they were not. And it was to take the politics out of those investments. And I know that many members supported that, in the sense that it was wrong to have a fund that had no oversight other than cabinet, and you know, really no rigor, no level of analysis, and would largely be driven by political concerns, Madam Speaker. And that is what we have today, only in a much larger scale. And I don't care if it's called Jobs Here or not, and I remind you again that we have seen virtually no job growth in Nova Scotia in the last year, and that is from the Atlantic Council. So, you know, we know that that's already a measure, and I look to see what happens in 2012, and we'll see where we go in this coming year. But it has not been successful to date, and yet the amount of money that's been pumped into it has been just amazing. It's been so large, and it's all been diverted away from that rigor and that careful analysis that we would expect from Nova Scotia Business Inc. And again, Nova Scotia Business Inc. has a board, they're business people, they have a responsibility, they take their time and do the analysis, and they are not in any way influenced by politics. They say no when it's necessary to say no. But now, Madam Speaker, in the meantime, the Department of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism is going from an estimate of $125.6 million last year to an estimate of $187.3 million this year. And that's an increase of 50% over what it was last year. And in fact, if you calculate the increase from the forecast of 2011, which is the more accurate figure, the forecast is where the department is actually coming in at year end, and you compare that forecast to what they're estimating right now, it's an increase of 60% in that budget. Now, most of this spending increase is due to the Jobs Here Fund, which again, I remind you, was formerly the IEF, the Political Slush Fund, which has been called exactly that by members of Cabinet that are now in Cabinet today. That is largely accounting for the increase. The budgeted spending in this fund is set to quadruple this year to $73 million, although actual spending under this fund is hard to predict because it can be topped up at any time at the request of Cabinet. So anytime there's a crisis or an emergency or not, you can top up the IEF, or let's call it the Jobs Here Now Fund. There's an awful lot of jingles in the budget and in the speech from the throne, Madam Speaker. And, you know, I think there's a term jingoism, I think. Would that cover that? Jingles? No. I've got my expert in front of me who says no. But it's all jingles, Madam Speaker. It's jingles and communications. And we're going to look as well at the increase in communications. Because one thing the government does really well is it pats itself on the back and it runs a lot of ads. And that has not been lost on Nova Scotians who are paying for those ads. When they turn on the evening news and through some of the most popular shows on TV, see all kinds of ads for the Nova Scotia government, for the Jobs Here Now starts and health care and education, and everything is so great. And again, you know, I think Nova Scotians know it, that the money's coming out of the government coffers, at the same time as librarians are cut from schools, and as special education teachers are cut, as the most vulnerable students can't find the help that they need. We're watching ads that are run at a great expense every night on television in this province. You know, I'm sure it'd be interesting to compare how much our government does this kind of self-promotion compared to other governments in Canada, and I bet that's one measure where we'll come out on top instead of the bottom. You know, I've given you the ones where we come out on the bottom, Madam Speaker, and there's many more. But I think that this government's taken no cuts whatsoever to their self-promotion and the effort to advertise and try and, I think, mislead Nova Scotians. Madam Speaker, as I said, I think Nova Scotians are smarter than that, and I think they can see it because they know what kind of costs they have. They know their concerns for their children finding jobs in this province. I happen to be at an age where my children are entering the workforce, and it's not really a very positive picture for Nova Scotians, and I know why so many young people choose to leave. They leave reluctantly, I think, but they often have to go in order to find good work and to get paid a decent amount for the work they do. And as I said, Madam Speaker, I don't know if you had heard it last time, but in Nova Scotia, the average weekly earnings are the second lowest in Canada. Only PEI is lower, and there's more than $100 lower than the Canadian average. Our average worker makes $765 a week. In fact, 50% of our taxpayers are in the lowest tax bracket. 50% in the lowest tax bracket. I think that's a terrible thing in itself. You might have a family income of $45,000, but that's usually two people working, and that's two people working and paying taxes in the lowest tax bracket that we have. And, you know, again, that's a very sad commentary in our province. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but I'm not sure that the way to get there is through propping up a political fund that doesn't have the scrutiny of experts that it should, that has diverted funds that could have been perhaps lent through Nova Scotia Business Inc. and would have had more well, just more validity. There is not the validity in this kind of fund and the way it's being spent. And there's the government that when they were in opposition, railed at previous governments about transparency, about accountability, about slush funds, and they are perpetuating, and not only perpetuating these funds, quadrupling them. That one's quadrupled. Yeah, again, you know, Madam Speaker, it really leaves one wondering what the heck. the budget, again, going back to economic and rural development and tourism, has actually, last year, their communications, I wanted to talk about the communications they're doing. It came in over budget last year by 20%, and this year it's now set to increase by 25%, or another $175,000. That's in communications alone. And I just don't think that is where the people of Nova Scotia want to see money spent. It may seem small in the scheme of things in a $9.5 billion budget, but it is significant. And if the government is serious about saying that they're cutting costs and that they're looking after the well-being of Nova Scotians, you've got to start cutting things like communications. You don't need big communication staff. You can use the media and get your message out the way everybody else does, the way other governments do. You don't need to buy all this media at the expense of Nova Scotians. I think the two examples I've just given, the IEF and the example of the communications budget within the Department of Economic Development and Rural Development and Tourism, both of those show where the priorities are for this government. The priorities appear to be a bloated, unaccountable slush fund for which Cabinet uses and to hand out large amounts of money for political purposes, and secondly, increased communications and marketing that try to mislead Nova Scotians about what's really going on in this province. I'm all for having a positive attitude and being buoyed and looking to the future, but let's not waste Nova Scotians' money, their hard-earned tax dollars, which we're entrusted with here in this House. Let's not divert them to things that are as useless as a lot of self-promotion and advertising on television. At a time when we're experiencing cuts to the classrooms, to teachers, we heard today, to librarians and educational assistants, the NDP have chosen to focus on ads and pre-election handouts. Madam Speaker, I talked about how there are a number of ways that staff have been siphoned off, I guess, taken off the books of Nova Scotia, and I'd like to just recap that as well. We have the Nova Scotia Agriculture College, which I believe July is the turnover date for that. They're going to be absorbed by Dalhousie and come off the books of the province of Nova Scotia. I am interested to know, there'll be a savings there because it will now become something the university manages, but what happens to all the assets of the Nova Scotia Agriculture College that we built up? All the land, the building, the equipment, all of the scientific labs, everything else. We had a huge investment in that facility in Truro, and that's just going to be gone. That's just being handed over to a private university. And that's just a question. I think we'll see a very large write-off coming in a few months' time when that gets passed over to no longer be an asset for the province of Nova Scotia. I think there could be a loss there to us as we go forward. However, I see that the staff will be spun off and it will look like they've done something in terms of tightening their belts. Conserve Nova Scotia, again, was spun off. It's now separate. It's no longer on the books of the Energy Department. But we are paying, every single one of us are paying through our Nova Scotia Power bills. We're paying a surcharge that adds up to $40 million, the budget of the new Efficiency Nova Scotia. So, you know, it's coming out of our pockets, but it's not going to be seen as a tax. That's how the government's hoping. It will be just seen as it being absorbed by Nova Scotia Power. But people are paying that, and that $40 million is a big hit when it was previously absorbed in the Department of Energy. It's a very worthwhile cause. Encouraging conservation is really important. But if it's so important, why couldn't we keep it in the Department of Energy and do it that way rather than forcing people to pay twice? We're still paying energy. Madam Speaker, we still have to pay the full shot for the Department of Energy, and we pay extra on our bills for Nova Scotia Power. So I think people need to be aware of that and to feel it as well. Now, I mentioned that the Department of Finance is another one that's not showing restraint. Up estimate to estimate from the time that this government came to power, it's up 30% in spending, and in FTEs, which is full-time equivalent employees, it's up 85 right now since 2009. So those, I think, are really not positive things for the people of Nova Scotia at all. Communications and finance also increased. I'm not sure why that has to go up tremendously. It's up 13.4%. I think if we looked at every department and every minister's budget, we'd see communications up, up, up. because, you know, why does finance need a bigger budget? Maybe it's to rename things like the capital plan, the Jobs Here Now plan. Maybe that's why. You've got to have some big thinkers to come up with that. You know, repackage things. But that's not being honest about how you're spending the money of Nova Scotians. That's trying to put a lot of spin on it, and I don't think that's what people want. We know the Comptroller's office has increased by almost 85%. It's up 175,000 again, and that's since forecast 09-10. Though we know there's been some reorganization there, and I know that the Comptroller, I think, is now seen as an associate deputy minister, but there has to be something more than that in that department. And let's have a look at Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations. For the service delivery line within Service Nova Scotia, they've seen their budget allotment increased by, it's amazing, and a whopping 567% since the estimate of 09-10, the first estimate from the NDP government. It's not a typo, it really is 567%. It went from 157,000, which isn't too much, to over $1 million. In fact, just in this year alone, it's a 325% increase from last year's estimate to this year's estimate. And one wonders what's been going on there to have it increase 500%. The Executive Director for Municipal Relations within that department saw that budget allotment increase by 70% since last year's estimate. At the same time, the grants and contributions to municipal units is flat at 0.1% growth. That's negligible growth, I have to say. Madam Speaker, I think that at that point it's worthwhile talking a little bit about the impact that the province has on our municipal units. I had a few points about HRM which relate more to my riding, but or just to ridings here in Metro. And I'm sure it would relate to others as well. But the government has very few grants and supports to our municipalities, so they have to raise all the funds to operate from property taxes on the commercial and on the residential homeowners. And that's putting a tremendous strain on our businesses. I spoke to you about business suffering under the high cost of power. They're also here in Metro suffering some really significant increases in their property taxes. And even though that is up to the city to set the rate, there's no question that if the city was getting proper support from the provincial government, they wouldn't have to do some of these things. And some of it doesn't even require a lot of money. I want to mention the HRM pension issue, which has come up repeatedly. The HRM pensioners, and particularly in the 2006 election, were actually organized in speaking to all of the candidates that were on the doorstep. Those were both the people collecting pension and those who are currently working for the HRM, and that's more than 4,000 people who have jobs with HRM, Madam Speaker, as I'm sure you know, having been a former councillor. But HRM has a requirement to work out their solvency on a going concern basis, as if they were to cease operation, they have to have enough money to pay out all of their pension obligations on that day. And it doesn't take into account the fact that there will always be a municipal unit, and that when Halifax and Dartmouth ceased to be separate units, they were revisioned, I guess, as HRM and still continue to operate and still continue to take care of their obligations. And really, it's very similar to the exemption that was just given to Dalhousie University. Dalhousie was on the precipice, really, of a strike with their faculty, and one of the things that allowed them to avert that strike was the ability to offer a different method of working out your solvency. And this change for Dalhousie was something that I think 7 out of 10 provinces allow their universities to do. It said, we agree that you're going to continue to exist. And even at law amendments last fall, there were faculty members that came and spoke at law amendments from Dalhousie, and they pointed out that the assets alone of the university were more than enough to take care of all of the pension requirements and all of the other debts of the university. So there was really no risk in changing that rule and allowing the university to relax that requirement for the solvency of the fund. They are still solvent, but to a different standard. And this makes a huge difference, but HRM isn't getting that same break. And I want to draw the member's attention, Mr. Speaker, or Madam Speaker, to the issue that's really at hand here. If we hold HRM to this higher standard of having to have a going concern solvency I guess, paid in amount, they have to then charge their members a lot more. It's going to be a crushing amount for the people who work for the city. They currently pay something like 10% of their income into their fund, into their pension fund. It's going to go up significantly, and that again takes us back to affordability. Less money in their pockets today, less ability to continue to really fund their needs to enjoy life in Nova Scotia and to be productive in Nova Scotia. But we can change that with just a simple rule change. Doesn't have to come to the legislature. A simple rule change would allow HRM to change their solvency method of calculation, and then those workers would have more money in their pocket. They wouldn't be under this tremendous stress. And the point, again, Madam Speaker, is that if the employees have to pay more, guess what? The city has to pay more because the city is the employer. And if the city has to pay more, they have one source to increase the money, the millions of dollars they would need, and that is from, again, their property taxes and commercial taxes. So it will come right back to homeowners, and doubly so to the commercial taxpayers in the city, because the commercial rate is more than double the residential rate, and it's not capped as residential rates are capped. So it will unduly hurt the commercial sector in HRM. This is a change that the province, the provincial government, the NDP government could choose to do today. Madam Speaker, it's a simple change. It costs us nothing. The risk is very low. Other provinces give their municipalities this break, essentially, this ability to keep their costs down. But we have not chosen to do that, even though we've just done it for a university. I don't see a big difference. We often talk about the MUSH sector, the municipal, the universities, schools, and hospitals in one, and that is a sort of group that kind of fit together. And I think that if you offer it to universities, you should certainly offer it to the municipalities. This is going to make a tremendous difference here in Halifax, not only for the many employees, the over 4,000 people who work for the city, but also for the taxpayers, every one of them. And as we know, that's 40% of the population of our province. So that's a very important thing that the government could choose to do, which wouldn't cost money, which would be prudent. Another thing that they certainly could do would be to review the tax break they just enforced again for Imperial Refinery. That is actually meddling in the business of the municipality. When it came before the House initially in 2003, the NDP members all voted against doing that. They realized it was meddling. I don't know what's happened, if that was then and this is now, but it's complete meddling. And, you know, of course the Imperial Oil Refinery is important to the province, but I think changing the municipal tax rate is wrong. If you want to support them, go back to your slush fund and support them that way. You've got this huge 4 times the slush fund that was there previously. So, you know, I think that there are other means available to the government rather than meddling with the HRM tax rate. And if you do it in one case, you're going to be under pressure to do it in others. And I think that's why the NDP, when they sat in opposition, saw that that was not a wise choice whatsoever, and they voted against it with the exception of the member for Coal Harbour Eastern Passage at that time. It's worth noting there was one dissenting vote in that time. It was a Conservative move to do it initially, and now it's been perpetuated in just a very recent move by the government. I wonder, Madam Speaker, if you could tell me how much time I have left.
Around 9 minutes.
Oh, it's very short. Well, thank you very much. That's important to know. The third thing I think that would help the city a lot would have been a faster answer on the convention centre. When the business plan was in the hands of the provincial government, the NDP government, it took a long time to get an answer, and that answer came back really on the cusp of a federal election, which again delayed the project. And you know, we're really hopeful that that will go forward. I think it has a lot of promise for our city, and for really, if it helps Halifax and HRM, it will help in a lot of ways through the hub really that we are here. It will help lots of other parts of the province, but we need to see that go forward, and that created uncertainty, which was unnecessary on the part of the government. So as I said, Madam Speaker, I don't have too much time left. I'd like to mention the increase as well. I talked about economic and rural development. I've talked about the Department of Finance and Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, all of which have some significant increases in line items in their budget and significant increases in people, just like the Department of Finance. The Department of Education, which is seeing the most drastic cuts on the ground, on the front line, where teachers and EPAs, assistants, teacher assistants who can help with the children that need special education and special help. They've all seen cuts, and we've seen one school board take the rather drastic move of cutting all librarians, and we hope that that will not have to come to be. But at the very same time as those cuts are coming down the pipeline, Madam Speaker, we're seeing a 21.3% increase in the senior management budget in the Department of Education. It was 32.9% up from the forecast last year. And again, for members who look at the difference between the estimate and the forecast, and for anybody who does look at our budget, for Nova Scotians who look, the forecast is the most accurate for last year because it's been updated periodically through the year when the finance minister has the opportunity to call out the press and say how we're doing as a province. So if you take the correct number from this current year to the estimate coming up, it's gone up 32.9%. And all that at a time when we're seeing cuts on the front line of education. You know, it is a shame. It's an absolute shame. We don't know why that sort of tightening of the belt and leading from, really leading from the top wouldn't have been evident from the Department of Education. You know, even if it's one person more in the minister's office, it doesn't show restraint. It doesn't show that you're taking care of the budgets, the way you should at the same time as you have to go forth. At the same time as the minister must go forth and talk about cuts to children and to education. Madam Speaker, as well, the Department of Justice is not left out of this. The Office of the Deputy Minister is increasing their budget in justice by $207,000 this year over the forecast last year. It's up 13.6% in the Department of Justice. This is at a time when we're finding it more difficult to access services, and last year's cuts in health were seen in each board. I won't have time to go through all of this, Madam Speaker. I know you'll be sorry to hear that, but I have some of the cuts that were seen last year, even when there was an increase to health. We have to remember that one of the biggest costs in health is the cost of the people who work in the system. And if they get pay raises, which they have been, then that is going to absorb all the increase they've been getting and more. And so even though they had a slight increase last year, Annapolis Valley Health Authority did get a budget increase last year from the estimate over estimate, but they still had to temporarily close medical beds at Soldiers Memorial. They closed an operating room for the equivalent of 3 months, and they had a corresponding closure of surgery beds. They reduced hours at the Berwick Clinic, and all of these changes impacted patients. Now, this coming year, they've got a budget increase of only $300,000. Last year it was $3.6 million. This year it's $300,000. They still have all the costs of their staffing and the increases and increments that have been put into place. So we're going to see more cuts on the front line of healthcare in that Annapolis board. In Southwest Health last year, they had a budget increase of $4 million, and they did not fill an RN position in the maternal children's unit. They reduced their home visiting program. They increased parking fees. They increased the rates in their satellite blood collection sites at a time when people are finding it harder to make ends meet. Madam Speaker, this has happened in every one of these boards, one after another. The Pictou Health Authority, for example, last year did have an increase of $3.7 million. This year, they're actually getting a reduction of $1.4 million. And so that's going to affect surgeries. It's going to affect frontline care in Pictou. It has to, because they can't keep pace with the increases that they have. Remember, again, each one of these DHAs has the increases in power that we feel personally. They have the increases in costs of traveling, of gas, of so many other things, of food, which they have to have in place. So the cost of hospital stays are much higher. So there are so many examples of these increases that are hurting people. And I look at the Department of Health and see things like the wait times project line item is now down to 0. Now, if that's because the federal government isn't funding us anymore, that doesn't excuse us not putting money into efforts to reduce wait times. And I mean genuine efforts, not efforts like sending out letters and then cutting people off who might not be alert enough or literate enough to answer those letters. Madam Speaker, cancer care Nova Scotia is down $400,000, diabetes care down $30,000, the nursing strategy line down $768,000. So these are all very significant changes. And Madam Speaker, I said last week, we are very disappointed in this budget. We don't see the help for average Nova Scotians, for every one of us who are feeling the increased costs of power, gas, food prices. And again, we have the highest consumer price index increase in Canada last year. And it'll be interesting to see where we go this year with the cost of gas already as high as it is. And Madam Speaker, this is a time really of austerity for people of Nova Scotia, and it does not seem to be as much so austerity for the bureaucrats or the ministers or government really of Nova Scotia. So we don't see that. We see a lot of the right words being spoken about being careful about money, but we still see the debt rising. I'm sure we'll hear more from that as we go forward. And we see that there are a lot of cuts to services that Nova Scotians expect if they're going to continue to pay high taxes. So, Madam Speaker, really in closing, I don't believe the priorities of this government are really the same priorities as Nova Scotians, at least the priorities that I've identified, if we can take where the spending increases are. Again, a gigantic increase in the Jobs Here Now Fund, which used to be the Industrial Expansion Fund, entirely controlled by the Cabinet of Nova Scotia. Yep, it didn't come before the House, and it can be increased. I said it's quadrupled, but it can be increased at any time without coming before the House. So this is a really unaccountable fund, and I imagine there's thousands, hundreds of thousands being spent to promote it, no doubt, as well. We see big increase in advertising and self-promotion and patting this government patting itself on the back. I'm sure we're due for more of that. But at the same time, we're seeing healthcare times, wait times growing. We've seen cuts to youth mental health, which I think is really one of the worst places you could possibly cut. We know we have so many young people that need help and families that are desperate for help, and yet we see a cut in inpatient beds. And I know the minister said that she wants a greater focus on community care, but that doesn't mean you get rid of the few beds that we have, because some families desperately need to have their children in the beds. Madam Speaker, the quality of public education has deteriorated in the last 3 years. Nova Scotians are not getting pay increases that keep anywhere near the cost of living increases. Power rates, gas prices, and government taxes are all making life more difficult for Nova Scotians. Madam Speaker, our economy is stalled. Our economy...
Order, please. Order. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park has the floor.
Thank you very much.
1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Our economy is stalled. We had virtually no job growth last year in 2011, as reported in APEC's newsletter. Consumer Price Index, the highest in Canada. Average weekly earnings are low. And this economy is stalled. All of that says so. Part-time jobs are up. Full-time jobs are down. And this budget has done nothing to help those families that are in greatest need and those businesses that are struggling with high power costs and other costs. It's done nothing to help those people stay afloat in this economy in this province. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Inverness. Order, please. I recognize the honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I'd like to start today by paying tribute. I know yesterday was an anniversary that marked the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and I know that about 3,500 lives, Canadians, were lost in that battle. And I'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to them today in this legislature. Because they did it. That's right. And many of them were Nova Scotians, and I know many even were from my own hometown in Judic. We have a a cairn that marks the name of many families, including some MacDonnells, and some other names of other people that are sitting in this legislature as well. And I guess, Madam Speaker, I was watching a program on the weekend, and they were talking about how these men were often digging tunnels and as part of the strategy to win that battle. And a lot of the men, a lot of the soldiers were engraving their names and things that were going on at the time in their personal lives. They were engraving symbols from their uniforms as pride in their country, showing pride in their country. And it's kind of sad that I suppose a good number of those men were certainly injured after making those engravings and maybe even have lost their lives, as evidence can still be found in the battlefields there today. So I just wanted to pay tribute, Madam Speaker, to those people for what they've done. And I know we're not using, I just wanted to reference that I'm wearing a pin today in honor of that, and I've chosen to wear it above my legislative pin in honor of what they've done to preserve and to maintain the democracy we have in this country. Thank you. And Madam Speaker, I also know that today marks Tartan Day, or at least we've seen legislation come forward, and I know the good member for Pictou East has provided me with some tartan today, and I thank him for that. And just a short note on that, I know that at one time tartan as a form of dress was outlawed amongst my people who came from Scotland because it was seen as a way of oppressing the people and driving their pride and their independence out of them. And we can see today, Madam Chair, that that has not happened. And I know that my own grandmother, I actually have it now in my possession, a piece of tartan that came right from Scotland that was made with real dyes from plants, not synthetic dyes. A lot of the tartans we see now, of course, they're all made with synthetic dyes now, and we see a lot of patterns, and everybody lays claim to a particular tartan. But way back then, when they were made with plant dyes, the accuracy of the colors was not something that you could achieve. You weren't able to achieve it with great accuracy, the coloring. So I just wanted to mention that as well, that it's good that we're remembering that that's a sign of a mark of those people, of course, who make up a good part of the province, and many of whom live in my own constituency of Inverness. But I will continue, Madam Speaker, with some comments on the budget. And I suppose the members opposite won't see anything positive in what I have to say for the remainder of my time here, but I will give it a try. So, Madam Speaker, when we look at the budget, I think about the budgets of the homes, households right across the province. And I think about how this budget may or may not affect Nova Scotians. And the first thing I can think about is the increase in the HST. And very sobering to note that for a family of four, after this budget year, a family of four in this province will have paid an extra, on average, $4,000 in HST. So that's money out of their pockets, into the government treasury that's there to help them. But you know, Madam Speaker, I wonder if Nova Scotians feel they're getting $4,000 more worth of services. I've heard an honourable member suggest that there's more advertising, and that's we've certainly seen that. But we also see, Madam Speaker, that, you know, if you were to ask Nova Scotians, I don't think they would find they're getting $4,000 more services for their family. And it highlights the importance of the decisions that government has a chance to make. They can choose to tax more, which this government has chosen to do. And we see that, you know, for the average family, $4,000 more out of their pocket. Or we could have a government that would choose to maybe live within its means, much like Nova Scotians are having to do. So what does that money mean in terms of revenue for the government in the budget? it means an increase of $400 million a year. And, Madam Speaker, I know we talk about numbers here, and for most people it would be hard to conceptualize really how much $400 million is. It is a lot of money. In terms of the budget, you're looking at approximately a 4% increase in the budget, which is quite significant. We're talking about a budget of approaching $10 billion, and you've got $400 million in HST. 4% is a big number on that budget, especially when we get down into fractions of a percentage are still large amounts of money. We're talking about balancing a budget. So, Madam Speaker, there's a lot of new money being brought in. And I also want to mention something that happened back in 2007, a significant item by the Minister of Finance's own admission that they are the benefactors of in this year's budget is about $186 million new dollars in revenue this year that come by way of a deal brokered between our former Premier Rodney MacDonald and a member from our federal member in the Pictou area, Minister Peter MacKay, and a deal brokered in 2007 that would see dollars coming to our province, recognizing that our offshore royalties that were coming to our province have been being clawed back. But this agreement sees the federal government recognize that essentially Nova Scotia should share should enjoy the full benefit of those offshore resources. So that deal brokered in 2007 by the then Progressive Conservative government and the Conservative government in Ottawa sees Nova Scotians $186 million richer this year in this budget. So, and I know that the government now is putting forward a piece of legislation which we've seen introduced here that looks at giving the province an ability to verify to ensure that the amount that we receive is accurate. And I think that's a good thing, Madam Speaker. But I will state for the record here today the credit to the member who represented Inverness before myself, former Premier Rodney MacDonald, for his initiative in securing that those funds for this province. And I think that's a point that should not be lost. So, with these new sources of revenue, Madam Speaker, that's a net sum of $586 million of additional revenue coming into this province. We are still seeing in this budget yet another deficit from this NDP government. So despite the new money that's coming in, they're still running deficits and they're still adding debt. More debt per year, in fact, Madam Speaker, than any other administration in the history of the province. So I guess the question I would ask when looking at the budget, why can't this government try to live within its means? We hear them talk about trying to make Nova Scotia more affordable for Nova Scotians, to make life more affordable for Nova Scotians. If only they would use that same philosophy in their budgeting, Madam Speaker. And I would submit to you, Madam Speaker, that if we ask ourselves what is driving the debt and the deficit budgets and the higher taxes, we've seen the rating agencies. We've seen the rating agencies, the organizations that look at the bonds of the province issues. We've seen them make a comment that this government has lost, or it has softening fiscal resolve, which essentially means that it's becoming lax. It's allowing the budget to get away from itself. It's allowing expenditure to rise without any discipline. And, Madam Speaker, we really need not be surprised, because many of the same members that sit on the government's side of this legislature today were voting against budgets by the Conservatives that were focused on bringing spending into line. Budgets that had been focused on government living within its means, so that life for Nova Scotians would be more affordable. And of course, I've talked about the HST. The increase in the HST makes life less affordable for Nova Scotians. So, Madam Speaker, people don't have to hear it from myself, they can hear it from the rating agencies who've commented that this government has had softening fiscal resolve. And I think that is because, philosophically, this government likes big government. And they need to feed off hard-working Nova Scotians by way of increased taxes and adding future debt for our children to pay off. This government likes big government, and they need that to support their spending. So what I would ask, Madam Speaker, is would the Minister of Finance turn his attention away from March madness, which he likes to speak about, and turn it towards FTE madness. That time of year, Madam Speaker, which we see right now, where ministers sitting on the opposite side of this legislature are able to pad their budgets with unused full-time equivalent positions to make it easier to meet their budget targets. And we've seen in the budget documents over 550 new positions that this government is adding this year. So the question becomes, Madam Speaker, are they actually adding these people? Well, they weren't there to begin with last year, although they were budgeted for, and the same was true the year before that. They're budgeting for these extra positions. They are not actually existing, and we know that because at the end of the year, the actual estimate number of people working in government is much lower than the estimate. Last year, I believe it was about 700 was the discrepancy. This year, it's 550. So, Madam Speaker, what is happening here is very obvious. Departments and ministers are going along with this, are padding their budgets with extra positions, so they have extra money in their budget, and then they're coming back and saying, oh, we've done such a wonderful job of budgeting, we're under budget. It didn't fool me. It didn't. So, Madam Speaker, I guess at the same time, when we see this securing of dollars into the centre of government, we're seeing what we saw today debated in this legislature, especially during question period. We're talking about librarians being, positions being eliminated from school boards. And the government is saying, well, that's the school board's fault. But ultimately, Madam Speaker, the buck stops with the government. And it's the government that is providing the budgets to those school boards and forcing them to make those kinds of decisions. And I can think, you know, we often hear a number touted, Madam Speaker, that, well, the per-funding ratio is higher than it's ever been. But sadly, I think, Madam Speaker, that is largely a result of decreased number of students in the province. And I know I've seen it in my own area of Inverness, where we've seen a massive decline in the student population, largely because of our rural economy. It's suffering. And people have been hanging around for a while. People are trying to find ways to make ends meet. We've seen significant issue past year with our paper mill in Point Tupper, which employs a lot of people in the Strait area, including Inverness County. And I've spoken to some of the workers there just in the last number of days. I'll be asking them how they're doing. And some of them have told me that they're not going to bother going back because they don't want to be in the same position in 5 or 10 years' time. And they're at a point in their lives where they need to get beyond that uncertainty. So, Madam Speaker, those are the very people that are at the age they're having children. And when we lose those people, we see more decline in our student population. And that's why I think it's so important for a government to table a budget that respects the need to support small business in our economy, not by increasing taxes, not by introducing labor laws that small business doesn't want, but by supporting it so that we can help to diversify our economy away from these large pulp mills, as one example, but also that we have a government that should be addressing power rates. Because in the case of that paper mill, its number one cost is power, using about 15% of the province's power. Anytime a decision is made like the Churchill Falls deal, it impacts them significantly. And I can think of the day when many people were cheering that announcement that this province is going to enter into agreement to obtain that power. And I hate to be a naysayer, Madam Speaker, but I know I was sitting here and I was feeling a bit down, because to me it just raised more risks, more questions. The questions I was asking myself in my mind: how much is this power going to cost? Because it could prove to be yet another nail in the coffin of that paper mill. And I know the member for Guysborough should be concerned about that as well, because if the cost of power skyrockets with the introduction of renewable energy at an overly aggressive rate, by this government's own admission, most aggressive targets in North America, and renewable energy is more expensive than the fossil fuels it's replacing, that is putting a nail in the coffin, and that member is putting a nail in the coffin of the paper mill. And I can tell you right now, today, when people working at the Point Tupper power generation plant, and I know because I speak to them, when they replace coal-generated electricity with electricity from windmills, the cost is 3 times as much. So, Madam Speaker, I think it's wonderful that we're trying to find ways to move away from fossil fuels, but does it make sense when the rural parts of our province, and really our whole province, is suffering because of these aggressive moves towards renewable energy, which are unsustainable for businesses like paper mills, but they're also an issue for tire makers like Michelin. And I know, Madam Speaker, many people in this province would say, well, let the paper mill die. You know, it's a dying business, let it die. Well, we are still going to need paper. We all have it on our desks here today. And there's something to be said for being one of the last mills standing. If some people in this world are going to make paper, we might as well try to make it here. And I know in my area, I think, and I'll say this about the city of Halifax, some people might find this odd that I would say this, but the city of Halifax, which is predominantly driven by government, should be thankful for the paper mill in Point Tupper, because for many years, that paper mill brought money into this economy, into our provincial economy from outside our province. I know my own cousin down on the Shore Road in Judic sold paper. He lived down in Connecticut and he sold paper into the U.S. And I know a lot of the money that came into our economy here came from the United States. That's new, fresh money into our economy to pay for things like the center of government we have here in Halifax. So whenever I walk down the street here and I hear somebody in this city say, let the paper mill die, I like to try to remind them of that fact. Because for many years, that operation contributed a significant amount of wealth into this province. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be able to continue. But what's going to be most important, Mr. Speaker, is the issue of power rates. And I don't know what the government is working on right now. I've tried to be supportive all the way with this issue with respect to getting that mill up and running. I've refrained from a lot of comment. I don't see this as a time to take political shots, but I do hope that the government is going to address power rates in a meaningful way, because just giving a handout to a mill to keep it running for 5 years is not what I want to see, because I see that operation as having been an asset to our province, and I don't want to see at this stage in the game it being seen as an organization that's in need of a handout to survive. So, Mr. Speaker, bringing it back to what I was talking about here, in our schools, where we're seeing a loss of children in our schools, I think that speaks to the need for government to try to right-size government, to make government more affordable, so that we can charge less tax instead of increasing the HST, like this government has done, so that we can run balanced budgets instead of running deficit budgets like this government has done, and so that we don't add to our debt for our children to pay in the future like this government has done. and done so, Mr. Speaker, in a manner that no other administration has ever done, at least to the same extent, because they've added more debt per year than any other administration in the history of this province on average. So, and Mr. Speaker, I must say that when governments get their house in order, it doesn't always mean bad things. And I know the members opposite always like to say, well, what would you cut? Because they try to put us on the defensive as if you could never cut anything. And I don't believe that's true, Mr. Speaker, because things change. And does it make sense for government to keep spending money on things that may no longer be relevant or needed? Why not change those things? And I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In the past, when the Conservative government, which gave this province 8 consecutive balanced budgets before handing the reins over to this government, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of expenditure that was made during times of cost-cutting and balancing budgets. One is in my own area. I'm sure most members here are aware, if you were watching the Masters golf tournament on the weekend, you would have seen advertisements for Cabot Links in Inverness, the new golf course. And I'm hearing members on all sides of the House acknowledging they've heard the voice of Donald Sutherland, who did those advertisements. And that's right, he's from Nova Scotia. And you know, Mr. Speaker, that was an example of an investment that the government made. And in fact, I remember when it was, at the time when it was brought to Cabinet, and there was an approval for $4 million in remediation work for the old mine site in Inverness, which was a beautiful piece of land, but it was covered in old mine tailings and had very limited value at that time. But there was an opportunity, a dream of some people in the community of Inverness to build a golf course that had been going on for years and years and years. And I must give credit to my predecessor, Rodney MacDonald, for having the initiative and the perseverance to bring that to Cabinet at a time when a lot of people in the room, I'm sure, were saying, you know, here we are trying to gain control of the fiscal situation of the province to bring a balanced budget. What are we doing here going to spend money on a potential golf course? But Mr. Speaker, the common sense of the day prevailed, and they saw and they had the vision to see that an investment at that time would lead to a golf course. And of course we see it advertised this weekend on television. And Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report that that initiative this summer will employ upwards of 145 people. A good investment. So Mr. Speaker, don't let the members on the opposite side of the House tell you that governments can't live within their means and still provide Nova Scotians with what they need. And Mr. Speaker, I hear they're saying they're doing it, but they're not. They're raising taxes. They're in receipt of offshore revenues that were received for the first time this year, significant amounts, but yet they're still running a deficit, and they're still adding debt, and they're still padding their budgets with FTE numbers in every department. Converse that, Mr. Speaker, with the record of the Conservatives, who delivered 8 balanced budgets in a row. But if we look at Mr. Speaker, if we look at what the members opposite, many of them who are sitting voting against those balanced budgets at the time, we should not be surprised today when those very same members have such an allergic reaction to balancing a budget today. So, and the members say that we gave them a structural deficit, but Mr. Speaker, we often hear this $1.4 billion number batted around, but really that was a modeled projection out into the future, based on the NDP's assumptions, nobody else's. With modest cost control, this government could have brought their house in order, but instead they let it get away from them. But we need not be surprised, because we always knew that the NDP governments would be a tax and spend government. Well, actually, my remarks today have all been about padding budgets. The only cuts I'm seeing are on the front lines, because the government is not focusing its energy on a program review internally to government. So ultimately, what we're seeing is they're handing the tough decisions down to the school boards and the district health authorities. And we see that with the reduction of librarians in the Chignecto District School Board. We see it in part, and I will say in part, because there are other factors at play, but I see it in Inverness at the hospital, where the DHA has made a decision to eliminate emergency surgery, and they're taking a second look at it now. And I think with their support and with the support of local health professionals, I think the community will get the result in the end that they would like to see, and that's a restoration of the service when it's needed. And I'm hoping, I know I asked the Minister of Health the other day if she would step in and ensure that happens. She chose not to say yes to that, but I'm hoping she doesn't say no should the District Health Authority and the health professionals come up with a plan to make it work. So I'm going to give you an example of another investment that the Progressive Conservatives made, an investment that was chastised by the government when they were in opposition, and that was the investment in science for our offshore oil and gas industry, in research. They said that the Conservative government of the day should not have invested that money. But ironically, just a few weeks back, we saw the Premier standing up and raising his arms in the air and claiming credit yet again for something positive that happened that had nothing to do with him, like the shipyard's contract. But let's stay focused on this. This was, well, Mr. Irving got a nice little $260 million, probably works out to about a 1% profit margin on that shipbuilding contract by way of the forgivable $260 million loan. So I have no doubt that Mr. Irving enjoys raising the Premier's hand. But we can't blame him for that. He's out to do his business, and he's a businessman, and we thank him for the jobs he's bringing to our province. But let's not kid ourselves on why he's so keen to raise the Premier's hand, Mr. Speaker. There are 260 million reasons why he's raising the Premier's hand. So back to what I was talking about, which is the investment the Progressive Conservatives made in the research for the offshore oil and gas. That is leading to $1 billion in exploration activity by Shell. So here. Well, I'm actually raising it as an example of how governments, when they're reducing expenditure and trying to live within their means, which we saw with the Progressive Conservative government, can still make investments that are good for the future. And I'm trying to make the point, Mr. Speaker, to the members opposite, that you can live within your means. You don't have... The only choice that you have is not just to raise taxes. You have other choices. You can live within your means.
Where'd you come from, Heather?
So, Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, those were investments that were made at a time when government was balancing its books. And conversely, we see today this government is running deficits while taxing more and spending on big government in Halifax instead of the people's priorities. Mr. Speaker, when I think about this budget, I also think of something else. Now, this to me is an item that is largely outside of the control of government, but it's something that I must speak about, and that is the price of gasoline. And I know I know one day I was at the mall in Port Hawkesbury and speaking with some people there, and they were talking about, because the area I come from, Mr. Speaker, we do have straight area transit now, which is a great service, and I hope that it continues to get used more and more as people experience the good service that it is. But many people in my area are required to drive. They just don't have the choice, Mr. Speaker. They need to drive to work. And for people who are on fixed income, people who are working without a chance maybe to increase their wages significantly, when the price of gas goes up, it hurts them the most. And they're doing their best. They're doing the best for their families. They're contributing in a meaningful way to the growth of our province, Mr. Speaker. But I feel for them when they have to pay more money for gasoline at the pump. And, you know, I guess all the more reason, Mr. Speaker, why this government should be focusing on the costs that it can control for people, specifically the HST. As I started out speaking about $4,000 out of the pockets of a family of 4 by the end of this year. That's the amount, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure that $4,000 could have went to a lot more things. And, you know, those are the choices that government has. And in my mind, this government has made the wrong choice. At a time when gas prices are as high as they are, Mr. Speaker, government should be doing the best it can. If the government actually cares about people, they should be trying to keep the costs they can control down. But we're not seeing that with this government. Keep the costs they can control down. HST is a cost that this government can control, and they're not trying to control it. They're increasing it. So, and I also think, Mr. Speaker, about the cost of power. Now, this is an area where I believe the government has great influence. Well, and this is an interesting point, because the members opposite say that the previous government messed it up.
They've done everything right.
And they've done everything right, yeah, exactly. But, you know, if we got off of fossil fuels entirely 10 years ago or 20 years ago, as the Premier had suggested, we would have been paying, can you imagine the enormous amounts we would have been paying for power bills the last 10 or 20 years? If the price of fossil fuels rose as high as it did, and I know fossil fuels have risen, I'm not disputing that, had we moved away from fossil fuels when they were that much cheaper towards renewable energy that is this much more expensive today, imagine, well, I'm trying to use everything at my disposal, Mr. Speaker, to show these, the members opposite. Well, I guess if we're looking at coal today costing this much and wind costing this much, and coal 20 years ago costing this much, if you want to pay this difference 20 years ago for the last 20 years, power bills would have been enormous, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think that can be disputed. We can pull out charts and I can use my hands in here, Mr. Speaker, but I don't think the members can dispute that. And if you go to Point Tupper Power Generating Station today, and you see when they pull off coal and move to wind, immediately the price of energy triples. Most Nova Scotians don't know that. They think that wind is free. But the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not against having some exposure to wind energy for diversification and for trying to advance that industry in the province. What I'm against is just blindly moving towards it without any regard for people's power bills or the impact it has on the economy, again, like on the paper mill in Point Tupper, or at Michelin, or at any number of businesses throughout the province. The more money people are spending on power, the less money they can pay their workers. That's pretty simple. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, I think what really proved what we've been saying all along happened recently. It's about a week and a half ago, I believe, when, again, the bond rating agencies came out and they said, they revised the outlook for Nova Scotia Power and Emera, Standard & Poor's, from stable to negative. And why was the change, Mr. Speaker? Because of the proposed cost of the Maritime Link project, which is $1.2 billion that is not going to be falling out of some kind of imaginary world into our hands here. It's going to come out of the pockets of you and I and every Nova Scotian that pays a power bill. 35 years stability. So, and why? What is the driving force behind that project? 35 years the zeal by this government to move into a renewable form of energy without analyzing the costs. And I mean, Mr. Speaker, would you go and buy a car if somebody told you got better gas mileage and it was going to cost you 3 times as much? You might want to find out what the gas mileage is. You might expect over time to make sure that you got 3 times as much value out of it before it rusted away. Well, the same is true for an energy project. And these are really important decisions, Mr. Speaker, because once they're made, we're locked in. We're locked in for the long haul. So we've called upon this government, and it's too bad they didn't allocate some money in their budget this year, to do an analysis of the cost of that project, to make sure it's in the best interest of Nova Scotians. And Mr. Speaker, even to make sure that it's the most efficient form of renewable energy that this government could be choosing. Instead, the government plows ahead without any concern for the power bills that Nova Scotians are going to have to pay. And I remember asking the Premier, in my early days in this legislature, Mr. Speaker, I asked the Premier how much power bills are going to go up in the next year because of his move to renewables. And he just blew off the question because he didn't want to answer it.
Maybe, did you ask it in Gaelic?
And I should have asked it in Gaelic. I might as well have. I might as well have. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, I guess that, to me, it highlighted that this Premier doesn't value looking at the dollars and cents of it all. Because if he did, he might be making very different decisions. But this is what happens when you get a government whose philosophy is so strong that it's willing to forget the facts. A vision, in my mind, Mr. Speaker, this vision will leave people behind. And how will it leave them behind? It'll leave them behind in the form of higher power bills. So, and this is not just what we're saying, Mr. Speaker. This is what the bond rating agencies are saying. There's no politics in that, Mr. Speaker. They're purely driven by market forces, by dollars and cents. Well, it is their God. But it's the one thing that you can trust in, Mr. Speaker, is they're going to act in their own self-interest. And that's what we have to recognize. And I think that should speak loudly and clearly to this government, that if they see this as a risk to investors, Mr. Speaker, then this government should see it as a risk to the people that are paying the bills. Because the reason why it's a risk to the investor is because it's a risk to the person paying the bill. So, you know, and I'm going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the federal government has recognized that it can't just go blindly off into choosing renewable sources and eliminating fossil fuels completely from the energy mix. And that was a prudent decision. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you in my area, there are people who are going to benefit from that, and those are the employees at the Point Tupper Power Generating Station. Those people aren't going to lose their jobs because the federal government has decided to allow Nova Scotia to keep that coal-fired operation in operation, recognizing that if you removed it today, you'd have an awful hard time replacing the energy that plant produces, and also recognizing that you would strand millions and millions of dollars in infrastructure that could no longer be used. It would be like retiring an automobile that was in very good condition before it had reached the end use of its life. Same thing as retiring a coal plant before its the end of its useful life. So the federal government has recognized that, and I think that's sensible. I think that's a common sense decision. And I know, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier even agreed with that decision. And to me, that's proof right there that getting beyond the philosophy and into the facts, even he ultimately buys into the reality that we can't just get rid of fossil fuels and move blindly towards renewables. So, and I know that keeping that coal-fired plant operational is going to result in us not giving up about $40-some million in infrastructure, which would have to be paid for by the ratepayer with no benefit to them. So I think that in this budget, and we saw it in the throne speech, some talking about, you know, how proud the government is for having the most aggressive renewable energy targets in North America. While it might sound great, Mr. Speaker, the reality is only too clear in our power bills. And we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on. And because, Mr. Speaker, renewable energy is not free. And I know that from my time in the investment world, if we look at, I still recall an effort being made to gain investment in renewable energy projects. And a couple of years later, the same people came back and said, well, we can't make any money at that. The only money you make is in the infrastructure that gets built for those projects, because the projects, they can't make profit on them because they're too expensive. So I think that tells you right there clearly, Mr. Speaker, that the market has found, the investment market has found that massive investments in this type of infrastructure, they don't pay off, and we're not ready for them yet as a society. And why would we invest massive amounts in technology today when quite possibly that technology could be improved tomorrow? And if it can be improved tomorrow, wouldn't it be better to be holding cash ready to invest in it than to have spent that money on the old technology, which may not be nearly as efficient? And we see this all the time, Mr. Speaker, throughout our world, whether it's, we look at the advances in computers, constant improvement, constantly faster, always getting better. The same, I believe, will hold true in the renewable energy sector, and better for us to make the investments in renewable energy when it makes sense to do so. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, you know, I would have liked to seen more of a recognition of that by this government in its throne speech and its budget. But instead, we see them cling to the pride they take in being the first to cross the finish line, to have the most renewable energy of any jurisdiction in the continent, on the continent. But, Mr. Speaker, I think that's going to end up costing Nova Scotians on their power bills. Well, they did, and they'll take you out, too. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on that. I'm not going to comment. A member said that that this is where the government is today, and I made the comment, well, people can take the government out as well. And I think it's important in the next election for Nova Scotians to understand that when they're paying higher power bills, that it connects back to the energy policy of the government. We can blame Nova Scotia Power all we want, and I certainly wouldn't be here to stand up for them. They are a private entity, and I have no doubt they're doing things in their own interest. But they must operate within the energy policy dictated by the government. And if this government is going to force them to move towards more expensive energy inputs, we're going to have more expensive outputs in the form of power bills. So when Nova Scotians, when you see that bill come in the mail, when you see that almost orange hue on your power bill, you should link that back to the orange colors of the NDP election signs. And remember that the people that increased your cost of living on your power bills was the NDP government. Maybe we'll use that in the next election campaign, Mr. Speaker. I think that's a pretty good idea. So, Mr. Speaker, the numbers don't lie. And, you know, despite what this government is saying, we know that the investment world recognizes, as we've seen by the bond rating agencies when they downgraded Nova Scotia Power and Emera, we've seen that the investment world recognizes the cash flow of Nova Scotia Power could weaken because they have to fall in line with the energy policy of the government. And we like to refer to it, Mr. Speaker, as the NDP bite the bullet energy policy. And, you know, we sometimes use that in a humorous way, but the point is trying to be made that the energy policy of the government is having a direct impact on power rates. And you know, to quote the credit analyst from Standard & Poor's, she had said that this will likely drive, speaking about the Churchill Falls project, the need for numerous rate increases that we believe heightens the regulatory risk in the Nova Scotia market. And what she means by that is increased costs and increased power bills. So, again, who can Nova Scotians thank for numerous power bill increases but their NDP government? So, and Mr. Speaker, people don't have to listen to me. And I know people don't trust politicians. And this government has given them many reasons not to trust them. All we have to do is look at the promises they made in the last election. That's true. And actually, I've ran out of notes. I'm going to have to speak from the heart here. But I think I have a few more left here. But you know, I spoke today about the HST. Well, they had promised they weren't going to increase that. They did. I talked about deficit spending. Well, they promised balanced budgets. They didn't hold true on that. Then they promised they weren't going to add to the debt, yet they've added more debt per year on average than any administration in the history of the province. That information has been tabled in the past. It's never been refuted because it can't be refuted, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, I still have some time left here. Do I have about 15 minutes? I think I will move into, since we're talking about promises. I think of the Eric Clapton song, Promises. But you know, one of the commitments that the NDP had made a commitment here to. One of the commitments that the NDP had made a commitment to was to create secure jobs that the Nova Scotia economy needs. And you know, when I read this, I often think, well, I know governments always try to claim credit for creating jobs, but I wish governments would stop doing that and recognize that the jobs are really created by the people who take risk in the economy. And in this province, by and large, that's your small business owner. So I would say, Mr. Speaker, you know, this government made a promise they're going to create more jobs. Well, we've seen an awful lot of decline in jobs. We've seen a lot of lost jobs in this province. I know that I've heard other members say that if the NDP hit their job targets with their investment in economic development, their new investment, if they just hit their targets, it would cost $200,000 in government spending per job.
They don't have targets, though.
Why doesn't this government instead focus on an energy policy that makes power rates more affordable? Why doesn't this government focus on keeping its spending in check so we can have lower taxes, so there's more money to flow around in the economy? Why can't this government listen to small business when small business comes to them in droves? Yes, in droves. When we debated Bill 102 in the previous sitting of this legislature, why doesn't the government listen to small business and tear up that legislation? That's what would help create jobs in this province. And I can think of something else, Mr. Speaker, and how this jobs moves into another promise that the government made was ensuring more young people stay and build a life in Nova Scotia. And, you know, I guess how can you expect Nova Scotians to stay here when the economic policies of the government kill jobs? People are not going to hang around if they can't find work. And, you know, we can't even begin to discuss helping children in school, looking after retired seniors, or helping the less fortunate when we don't have a good economy where people can find work to generate the tax dollars to support all those things. So this is why, Mr. Speaker, we think Nova Scotians in the next election will be looking for an alternative. And we will offer them one. And I guess the question I would ask is, where is our future with a declining economy and our young people moving away. And I know the people in the area I represent want to see a future because they love the area. They love the fact that their family is there. You know, I can think of recently with the situation with the hospital, how we recognize sometimes it takes bad things to happen in your life to make you appreciate the good things around you. And when we looked at the government decision to eliminate emergency surgery, it made us stop and appreciate how lucky we are to have the health care system we have in Inverness, which, Mr. Speaker, in my eyes is a real asset to the province and should be invested in as such. And I know the previous Conservative government invested the money in the expansion of that hospital and the construction of the new nursing home and the fact that those facilities have been moved together. They're joined now. The shared services are going to save government money. Those are good investments. But to my point, you know, in seeing what was happening, we realized the special care that we get in Inverness, and it's one of the reasons why people want to live around home, Mr. Speaker, is because we have good neighbours, and it extends into the government services we receive. And the hospital is a great example. I've seen it with my own family, you know, family members going into the hospital, and the care they receive there, and I don't want to downplay the care they might receive at other facilities in the province, but I've seen it to be better there. And I think it's better because people know each other. And when you have healthcare professionals looking after a loved one, they're not just looking after a stranger, Mr. Speaker, they're looking after somebody that they know, who may even live in their community. And that makes a difference. So I think all the more reason, Mr. Speaker, why governments and why should I form part of a government someday, will want to make the decisions in government when we're putting together budgets to make sure that we do things that support those local economies so we can maintain the way of life that we have in places like Inverness and in Inverness County. And Mr. Speaker, that comes down to having a good policy around taxes to make sure the economy is competitive with other jurisdictions, to make sure that we have good labor laws, so that, you know, a company like Michelin, if they decided to invest in another plant in Nova Scotia, and say, for instance, they chose the Strait area because of its shipping advantages as being the best port in the province, that they might choose that area because a labor law that the NDP government put on the books is no longer there. So, Mr. Speaker, what I'm referring to there is now that we have this labor law that was introduced, when the executives from Michelin and Nova Scotia go off to the parent company to lobby for further investment, because Michelin is selling more tires and they need to add capacity to support that growth in sales, that they look at Nova Scotia, that we arm those executives to go to bat for us, and we give them a good bat, that we don't give them a bat full of holes in it because we have taxes that are too high, because we have labor laws that make us uncompetitive with other regions around the world. So, Mr. Speaker, that's and that we have a government energy policy that ensures that the plant here is at least going to be as competitive as other areas of the world for its energy. So, Mr. Speaker, if you look at areas across the country for energy, you look at provinces, the provinces that are doing the best are the provinces that have a good advantage. They found a competitive advantage with their energy. Quebec, you see hydro energy. Alberta, Saskatchewan, BC, you see a lot of natural gas. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, if we look at this budget, and if I look at the future of my area, I need to see a government putting forward a budget that takes those things into account, that gives us a fighting chance. Because if we have a government that produces a budget that doesn't give us a fighting chance, well, we're going to continue to see more of the same. And that's more young people leaving and a further decline in the economy. And we have too many good things happening. I know I can speak, I'm sure the members feel the same way about their areas, but I have too many good things happening in the area I represent to let this government destroy that. And I know, Mr. Speaker, if Nova Scotians are looking for an alternative in the next election, we're going to put forward budgets and policy that's going to help those areas so that we can stay alive and stem that tide of out-migration and find ways to bolster the economy. And I can think of another investment made by the previous Conservative government in high-speed internet. And I know there's a lot of people in my area who never had high-speed internet before that have it now. And that opens up doors, Mr. Speaker. So if only this government, with its budgets, would live within its means, reduce its expenditure, reduce its taxes, but still make those smart investments, we would have some hope in Inverness. But instead, we see more taxes, taking money out of our pockets. We see more debt that our children have to pay. We see no regard for trying to control costs here in the centre of government. And we have to put a stop to it, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be asking Nova Scotians. Ultimately, they will decide. And I know in the next election, which I know the Premier said that it won't be this fall, but I don't know. I know I'm going to be ready should it happen this fall. And I hope Nova Scotians are too. And I hope that we are able to clearly explain these things to them so that they can make an informed decision about who should be running this province, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I shall conclude my remarks. Thank you.
The estimates are now referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Supply onto Her Majesty. I will now recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that with the consent of the House resolve itself into a Committee of the Whole House on Supply.
Is it agreed? The Honourable Member for Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my understanding that I have up to 15 minutes to speak going into supply.
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
It's carried, though. The motion is carried. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. I had to say that before you stood up.
No problem, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, it gives me pleasure this evening to speak on a matter which is always of great concern to the residents of Richmond County, and that is roads, which I'm sure that the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal will be well aware of. Mr. Speaker, we've certainly had a level of success in the last 2 years in being able to address some of the long-standing roads that needed repaving and resurfacing in Richmond County, but needless to say, there still remains a number of significant roads on that list. And today, rather than speak of the successes we've had, I want to take the opportunity to speak to the House and speak to the Minister about some of the roads that remain as a concern in Richmond County. And I'm sure I will not have time to name them all, but I will do my best to highlight some for the Minister and for his staff. Earlier today, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to table a petition on behalf of the residents of Harbourview Crescent, which is in the community of Lewsdale. Now, Harbourview Crescent is a road which is about half a mile long, I would say, which is right off of the main road when you come into Lewsdale. I believe there's, I think the number I was given is close to 60 homes along this road, and I should point out that there's been a number of new homes which have been constructed on the road as well, bringing some young families back to our community and making significant investments. This road has not been paved since a long time ago. I believe some of the dates given was into the 60s and 70s, and over the years it's been patched, and then the patches were patched, and then those patches were patched again. So needless to say, the road is now at a point that's completely deteriorated and simply cannot be patched anymore. It needs to be resurfaced and needs to be new asphalt needs to be placed on that. And I'm certainly hoping that the minister will hear the concerns. It's not often that residents of Richmond County sign petitions, but it's certainly an indication of how desperate they feel the situation has become on that road. And in the community of Louisdale, you also have Silver Oak Drive, which is a similar situation. It's off the main road just before the intersection to Grand Dance, and as well that this probably was paved last time Harborview Crescent was paved, which was many years ago, and it as well is to the point that the road is pretty much completely deteriorated, and as well Duncan Road, which is another road off of the main road in Louisdale, which obviously needs to be addressed. Mr. Speaker, in previous years, I have to give credit to our area manager that we have in out of the Port Hawkesbury office that services Richmond and Southern Inverness, Mr. Darren Blunden, along with his operations supervisors, who've been very creative with the RIM funding that they receive. Now, what is RIM? RIM is an acronym for Rural Impact Mitigation, which was special funding that was brought in by the previous government, which was meant to assist some of the local area garages in dealing with graveling, brush cutting, minor repairs like that are so important to our rural communities throughout the province. With that RIM funding in our area, they were able to take and purchase asphalt and do a number of smaller side roads that are obviously not big enough to have a capital tender call for them, but certainly roads that have residents on them that need to be addressed. Unfortunately, as the minister is aware, last year the Department of Transportation Infrastructure and Renewal reduced the funding to the RIM program by 50%, and this year that reduction has stayed in place, so it's a 50% reduction again this year, which basically means there will be no asphalt work at all in Richmond County this year because of the limited funding. So it makes it that much more of a challenge for some of these side roads, and I do hope that the minister will look at the concerns I've raised. I will be meeting with some of his senior staff very shortly to once again go through some of the priorities and to discuss some of those, but hopefully there's a means of possibly putting a tender in place for the main road in Louisdale, which needs to be redone, and possibly add these side roads as part of that main tender. One of the other roads which the minister will recall that I raised with him, in fact he visited with me and came down to the wharf. Always good to get a Minister of Crown on a wharf to speak with fishermen, residents, and a local buyer that was there. And it's the Little Harbour Road in Lardwes. This is a gravel road. The question is, how do we get that gravel road paved? Because the situation has become even more dire for that road, because since the minister last visited, the local buyer and processor has built a live lobster holding facility, which just during the construction phase had such an impact on the gravel road, making it almost impassable once the soft season kicked in, and meaning that there'll just be that much more traffic on this road. Now, I know that the department, to their credit, did put in a counter and came back and said this does not have the amount of traffic needed to justify under traditional rules for paving roads. If we use that approach, this road will never get paved, because it's a seasonal road. It's going to be during lobster and crab season that the heaviest traffic is, and I would again argue with the minister that this needs to be looked at as an economic development tool for this community. If we use the traditional rules of it has to have this many cars to justify paving, that road will never get done. Let's accept that, because there will never be, that'll never meet that provincial standard. But I think the minister himself saw the amount of activity that takes place. There are millions of dollars worth of seafood landed at that facility. That is all money that is taxed, that comes back to the coffers of the province, and for this community, that is the economic engine. So I do hope that the minister is willing to look outside of the box when it comes to this road, to find a way to get asphalt on that road, to encourage development at Little Harbour Wharf, to encourage growth in that area, and to ensure that the residents, the fishermen, the workers have a decent road to travel on, because gravel simply will not be able to handle the heavy traffic that takes place on that road. I know that there's been some suggestion that chip seal might be a solution, but I know that even our local area manager and staff have questioned whether chip seal could handle the heavy traffic that travels on this road. During the height of lobster and crab season, there's numerous 18-wheelers that are traveling on this road daily. So I'm not sure, I'm certainly not an engineer, but I would have to raise a question as well whether chip seal would be appropriate for this road because of the heavy traffic. But I do hope the minister will be willing to look at that again. One of the other roads that I raised with the minister briefly during the last session, but he did indicate he was aware of it, is a Grand Gully Road over in River Bourgeois. Now that is a gravel road as well, and the problem is right about the middle of the road, it comes to a point where you're driving right along the ocean. And I have to say it's one of the most beautiful areas in Richmond County, but the problem with it is that the road is almost at the same level as the ocean. And on the other side of the road, there's a bit of a, I'm not sure how you'd describe it, it's not really a pond, but it's a place where water gathers, and depending on the amount of rain, it's either going to be dry or it's going to be full. What happens is often, we saw it again this winter, is with high tide and with heavy rains, the road's completely flooded. And with the cold weather, it brought ice, it brought conditions which basically made the road impassable. For the locals, they know what to watch for. They know it's a dangerous area. But for anyone visiting or anyone coming to the area who wouldn't recognize it and that would hit that water, especially with a car, more than likely they would flood their engine or they'd have serious damage done to their vehicle, especially if there was ice in that area. The problem with that road, what we're being told by the engineers, is that the road bed has to be built up. It has to be built higher than the level of the ocean, and there has to be piping underneath that the water can freely flow underneath without impacting the road itself. That is going to require significant capital investment, which is beyond the budget of the local area manager. So it's going to take money either out of the Sydney office or out of the Halifax office to fix this problem. But it has to be fixed. The residents have been more than patient, but they're very frustrated, and they are continuing to ask when are they going to see a solution, because it's only a matter of time before there's going to be a serious accident at this location. So I know the minister has said he's aware of it. I do hope that either while the House is sitting or when it rises, he will take the opportunity again, and I want to extend the invitation for him to come visit in Richmond County so he can see these roads for himself, maybe talk to some of the residents as he did when he was in Little Lance the last time, when he was over in Little Harbour, and be able to hear their frustrations directly. Mr. Speaker, as well, that's some of the other roads I wanted to talk about are some of the ones that require capital funding, which basically means tenders for paving and resurfacing. We have the Whiteside Road, which is just across the street from the Straight Richmond Hospital. Again, another area that's seen a number of new homes go in. It's a paved road. It's been patched more times than I even want to think of, and it clearly needs to be resurfaced. There's tremendous opportunity there for growth in housing development, but that road clearly needs to be addressed. As well, the community of Dundee. Last year, I certainly want to commend the minister. There was a tender from the County Line Road coming through Black River right up to the Black River Bridge, which is a new bridge that was replaced a few years ago. So that section of road has been done. But when you leave that bridge and you head towards the Dundee Resort, heading up to St. George's Channel, the road is almost, let's say, it's basically impassable. It's in terrible condition. This is one of the most beautiful drives along the Bredor Lakes that we have in Richmond County, and the road is completely deteriorated. I'm certainly hoping this year that the minister will continue the work that was done on the road leading up to the Black River Bridge, and will continue the next section for 5 or 6 kilometers, which would take you in front of the Dundee Resort up to St. George's Channel, where it will meet the new pavement that was done, I believe, in 2007. So that entire section will have been repaved and will be a road that will be in great shape. One of the other roads that the minister will recall that I did raise with him is the Cape Ogat Road, which is a road off of the Low Road in Arishat, and which is where the Clearwater Live Lobster Holding Facility is located. I should add, Mr. Speaker, the largest live lobster holding facility in the world. This is a major employer for our community, and the road itself leading to that facility has become in completely deteriorated state. It follows right along the Arishat Harbour with a number of twists and turns, and I have to say, Mr. Speaker, residents are terrified whenever they meet some of the 18-wheelers coming in either to pick up lobster or to drop off lobster in some of these turns, because the road is so broken up, especially along the shoulder, that these trucks are finding themselves on the wrong side of the road in order to try to navigate. So it's certainly not a criticism of their driving, but it's a criticism of the condition of the road, and it's become a safety concern. It's not just the workers want to have a nice road to drive on. For local residents, especially parents with school-aged children, they are terrified that there's going to be a significant accident along this road because of the way the pavement has become broken up, some of the major potholes, and even some of the erosion that's taking place along that road. One of the other roads as well that someone reminded me recently, and that I know very well because I grew up on it, is the main road leading into Petit de Gras, which is known as the Stretch to Boudreville Road. This is the main road leading into the community. I believe last time it was paved was back in the 1970s. This clearly is another road as well that many people are complaining. There's a number of businesses located along this road. The ball field is along this road. The church is along this road, and it clearly needs to be addressed, and the only way to do so is going to be with new pave. Ending on a positive note, I do want to commend the Minister for continuing the commitment to complete the upgrading and resurfacing of Route 4. I've heard tremendous comments of the work that was done, and I know many of us who travel to Cape Breton and those who travel further in Richmond County are very happy to see this road is finally becoming in a modern state. And I know that the Minister is scheduled to call another tender this year, which will take the paving from Johnstown west towards St. Peter's, with the final section to be done in 2013-2014. So the Minister made that commitment, and I'm certainly pleased to see that that commitment will be maintained, and I do hope that he has taken note of some of the many other roads that need to be addressed in Richmond County. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Member for Argyll.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to stand tonight and speak for a few moments to a number of projects that are happening in my constituency, and you know, maybe underline a few, but also thank the Minister for a number of projects that are actually happening in and around Argyll. And I just wanted to offer my thanks to the Minister. So I'll start off on the good note. Maybe I'll end it on a good note as well. Of course, the one that I'm very impressed with right now is the work that's being done on the 103. And not only are we seeing, I mean, you know, I think kilometers and kilometers of work being done on the 103 from my constituency, Tuscott, going to Yarmouth. They actually been marking off the road. I think Maritime Fence has been there, putting in new guardrail. So it looks good for the area to finally get that final piece of highway done up. So it's good to see that kind of work happening in our area. The other thing that I wanted to underline on the 103 is, as you know, many of us who travel the 103 a lot, I know the Minister of Fisheries does a lot as well. It's good to see the work starting to happen around Granite Village, in through Port Mattoon, in that area, as they're cutting the line. They're cutting the line and doing the grubbing. It looks really cool as to see the work that they've already done up and through that area, to see the amount of work and to actually see the track of that highway, because I know we've been talking about that expansion or that bypass for, I think we're going on 6 years there right now, that the announcements were made, then they started going out and trying to purchase the properties, and then it just sort of takes the life of its own, and we all tend to forget about it a little bit until we actually see the work actually happening. So it's good to see that that amount of work being done. I know for me, who travels that road a couple times a week, and then many of the truck drivers and stuff that will be driving it will be welcomed to be able to drive on that bypass through probably one of the more dangerous points of the 103, which is down through Granite Village, down through Port Mattoon as you get into the Queens County area. And I think that's going to be a wonderful addition to our highway system as we finally try to get that highway finished from Halifax all the way down to Yarmouth. I want to maybe underline a couple of places that I'd like to see a little bit of work done, and I know the Minister's listening attentively, and I want to thank him for the work that we did get last year on Highway 3 through East Pubnico. There was a really nice stretch of highway done from, I believe, from the 33 335, which is the Pubnico Road, going towards, I think it's the Willett Road, which is, like I said, a very good chunk of road. But of course, there's still some need as we continue to go further down towards Shelburne. There's a couple pieces of road that are, of course, right near a number of fish plants there that over the winter really got themselves beat. And there's lots of it that have chunked up. I know the OS and the area manager have been looking at that. I know they put some coal patch in to try to keep it, but there's going to have to be some work done near the, I believe it's near Eastside Fisheries and down near the Lower East Pubnico Wharf, that are going to need some work as it goes along. So I just underline that issue. And one that the minister and I have talked about on a number of occasions, which is the Little River Harbor Camoes Hill Road. This is a secondary road, so this makes it, I think, a little more difficult to find a place for it within his 5-year plan. But it is, I think, an important road that does service a pretty neat little community that have been driving on patches of patches of patches. And I think it's time that maybe someone looks at it and puts it in a plan to see, you know, we'll continue to do certain pieces of this over the next 5 years and just get it done, because there's a number of places that are very difficult to drive through. You do have to watch what you're doing, and I don't know how this winter. I haven't been there since really spring started, so I don't know what the pothole situation is in that area. But I know in the past it's been some concern. Number of potholes around, but not bad this year. I got to say, this has been, I think, a good year in my neck of the woods for potholes. I only had the one person give me a jingle looking for a new tire. I think it was traveling across the Dominic Road, which cuts from Highway 3 over to, I think it's 334. I might be getting my numbers mixed up, but this is the one that goes through Plymouth and all the way down to Wedgeport. And there's a little cutoff road that people take. And there was a big hole there, and unfortunately one of my constituents hit that a little too hard, and she did lose her tire. I don't know if she lost the rim on her car or not, but I did refer it to the departments. We'll see what the department is going to say about it. If I look at it personally, I think there was a lot of room there, but who knows? And then the secondary roads too, the dirt roads, haven't done bad either. Coldstream Road, which is the one way at the end of the 308, in the north end of that, in the community of Quinnen. There's a number of people that have basically taken cottages, transferred them into their homes, now live down the end of this dirt road. It is in the need of some ditching and some cross culverts. And I would like, hopefully, and I've mentioned this again to the area manager, that this is maybe some work that we need to look at once everything dries up, that they can maybe see some time to get some culverts switched out. As an update, maybe to all members of this House that know the concern that we had in the flooding last year in November, that of course we lost one of our bridges, which was the Tuscott Bridge, which connected along the number 3 highway. There's a wonderful new bridge sitting there. The company that did put it in, I think, have done a phenomenal job in constructing it. It is now sitting in one full piece, it seems, sitting up on the foundations. The extent of that foundation seems to have been poured, and the casings are all off of it. We're now waiting for, I think, just basically the sloping of that road, and then of course the paving towards the end of May, I think, was the target date for that one. But I want to thank the minister for his input on that one, and of course, and I know it doesn't happen often, but thank government for their work in securing, of course, the funding through that, because if I do understand, that went through a little bit of disaster relief as well to help pay for that bridge. And it's funny because I do take a lot of questions on it of when is it going to be done. You know, how come it's that kind of bridge, I think, is what you get a lot of time as well, because it is a Bailey bridge. It is a panel bridge. But like I tell most people, is that it's a permanent Bailey bridge. Probably through my lifetime that I'll probably never see a replacement to that bridge. But looking at it, I think I'm much more comfortable in saying that because of the kind of bridge they did put in. It is a bridge that I think will be there for an extremely long time because of its extra construction, of its extra size, and I think it was almost a $4 million installation by the time it's all done. And I can tell you, it's kind of weird because when you think of it, the 103 highway is right next to it. There is a way around. But what we're finding is there's a lot of individuals that maybe don't like the speed of the 100 series highway that continue to take the number 3. And I don't know if the Minister of Fisheries have noticed the number of fender benders and accidents at the Runnerton Road, as people sort of had come off the Tusket flying along and then stopped and then turned left on the highway, going towards the number 3 highway. It's happened a ton of times now, so it'd be good to finally get that bridge back into circulation so that we can get that kind of left-turning traffic off of our 100 series highway. And then, of course, that goes on to maybe some further updates to that road. And I think maybe in concert with the federal government that we can get a couple of overpasses that were missed when the bridge was originally built by the Liberals back in the early 70s. It'd be nice to have maybe a completed highway system along there, especially the Pubnico intersection, as a lot of fish trucks come off of that intersection. It would be really nice to see a full intersection on that one. But then again, I'm very happy with what I've gotten in the last number of years for the area, so I'm not going to go extend myself too far on that one. The final one I want to talk quickly about is the Indian Sluice Bridge. I want to say, I think there's a wonderful project going there. I want to thank the government. I don't know, again, this is 2 thanks to the government in one night here. But I want to thank them for their inclusion in the was it the budget speech or I think it was the budget speech that the Indian Sluice Bridge was mentioned in as an infrastructure project. You don't know how important that is to the community of Surratt's Island, Morris Island, to know that their bridge has not only been announced, been talked about, they know what kind of project is there, but to also see the extra commitment that this government has put towards making sure that that bridge does go into place. And I thank and I'll continue to thank the minister for his input on this, because it wasn't just me beaten down on it. It wasn't just certain people beaten on it, but it was a community group that got their stuff together and was able to present to the minister and to the department to truly understand what that bridge and how important that replacement was to that community. And I give full kudos to the Department of Transportation for their input on that one. Someone did mention Osprey there. And as you know, last year, as the community group asked for an out of department engineering study done of that bridge, because we always didn't necessarily trust everything the department was telling us. So we said, put that in the hands of a contractor. Let them look at the bridge. Let them tell us what's wrong with that bridge to see if it needs replacement now or later. And what happened was they started their work, but what happened was that there's an osprey that sits on the top of that center span. Has been living there for a few years, having its young, dive bombing people that walk by on the bridge. But for the most part, people have liked having the osprey at the top of the bridge. But of course, the work was shut down because that osprey was there having its young. And the project got delayed over a long period of time until things were able to get done. Now, kudos again to the department that they were able to get some dollars available to basically move the osprey nest from here to another site just down the road a little bit. Now, I think you've seen these along the electrical system, where you sort of see the power poles and then you see another pole beside it with a big box on the top where either a bald eagle will sit or osprey or other bird that they really don't want on top of the electrical system. Well, this is the idea that Department of Natural Resources took to take the osprey and move it. Well, they were able to beat the osprey insofar as getting it out before the osprey came around, but within days of that move happening, the osprey came from wherever the osprey comes from every spring. It's probably much smarter than we are. It goes south. I'm pretty sure it goes south. So it shows up and it finds that its house is not there anymore. It's not on the center span of the big green bridge. So the osprey has been endeavoring to reconstruct its house on top of our 103-year-old bridge. So I don't know what that will impact the work to that bridge this summer. I think we should be okay, because I know the number, sort of the steps in that project that will need to go. But we're going to have to find a way to get that silly thing off of that bridge and get it into its new home just a few hundred meters down the road. I think it's just funny, because after all that work and all the science that would have gone into moving the structure, I think they're creatures of habit. They like being on top of the big green bridge where it gives you a sort of a panoramic view of the Indian sluice. Well, I tried to talk to the Osprey, but I tell you, it doesn't listen to me, so I'm hoping that maybe the NDP might have a better chance at it than I do. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it goes. There's a couple of other things that are very important in my constituency that maybe I'll have another opportunity to talk about in the near future that don't necessarily revolve around transportation, even though I do have one more bridge beyond that one that might need some looking at, but I'm not going to worry about that one this night. But there are a couple of projects that have been stalled over the last number of years. One of them, of course, is the long-term care facility in my constituency, which was to see an expansion, a number of beds. That seems to have stalled again, so I'm just wondering where that is in process. And I know that the minister, during those estimates, I'll have the opportunity to ask her of that. And also the issue of the Centre Scolaire Communautaire in our area, the school community centre in Tuscott, the Parobus Centre, which of course many of you would know houses a community offices, a preschool. It holds a theatre, and through a number of issues that happen in the area in regards to our RDA, there are a number of unpaid bills to the construction of that facility that have not been addressed yet. So I'm just wondering, maybe from the Minister of Economic Development, and we'll be able to have an opportunity to talk about that in the near future as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the constituency of Argyll and where we've been over the last year. But there are, of course, the concerns of its economy, the economy that themselves relating to the tourist industry, the issues in and around the fishery itself. I know we've had low prices, but of course they've been landing more lobster, I think, than they've ever seen before. So maybe those things have balanced themselves out. Yet there is a tremendous concern for that fishery in southwest Nova Scotia, and maybe we'll have the opportunity during estimates as well to speak to the Minister of Fisheries. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I thank you for the opportunity to speak tonight and look forward to moving on to estimates in this chamber.
Thank you. We have now reached the hour of interruption, and the topic is chosen earlier by the Honourable Member for Yarmouth, and I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise in my place and speak to the late debate topic. Therefore, be it resolved that slashing education budgets by $65 million over the past 2 years is having and will continue to have a detrimental effect on students and their education outcomes in this province, and call upon the government to restore education funding. This, Mr. Speaker, is a debate that began, as you will recall, with the infamous 22% exercise. The foolishness that boards were asked to go through, and the anxiety and the turmoil that parents and teachers and students were asked to go through, while the government threw out this ridiculous proposal or ridiculous threat that there would be a 22% reduction in education. Now, anybody who understands anything about education would recognize that that's impossible. But it did generate a lot of anxiety and worry, and if that's what the government was